class, and welcome to Developmental Psychology. This week we will be exploring late adulthood. So, late adulthood is a time of profound change. Change in the way that life is led, and change in the physical experience. It's kind of the time when you will inevitably find that your body starts to, in essence, turn on you. So let's begin with some physical changes in late adulthood. First, there are fatty concentrations of cholesterol in the heart and arteries that will begin to reduce blood flow throughout the body. There is also degeneration of the blood vessels, leading to increase in blood pressure. Yet these changes, while most evident in later life, don't necessarily originate in this period. In fact, losses in cardiac output, that is the amount of blood and the heart can pump throughout the body, are evident from early adulthood onward. There is also a diminishing in the lung capacity as a person ages. Older people frequently report shortness of breath, particularly after mild exercise, such as climbing stairs or raking the yard. There is changes in the gastrointestinal system, such as deterioration of the lining of the intestinal tract and reduction of gastric juices. And these contribute to the frequent intestinal complaints of the elderly. And also, normal immune function begins to decline with age. And in the elderly, they may be related to an increased incidence of things like cancer. And nearly all of the sensory systems show loss of efficacy in old age. Probably the most usual sensory loss associated with aging is hearing. Now, according to some research, 17% of people who are 65 or over show signs of advanced hearing loss due to degenerative changes in the auditory system. But there are also changes to the visual system. For example, about 17% will develop cataracts, a cloudy or opaque area on the lens of the eye that prevents light from passing through and thus causes a blurry vision. And many elderly people also suffer from retinal disorders that result in blindness as a result of building up fluid pressure in the eye, which often damages the eye internally. There are also concerns around taste and smell. Elderly people have problems with regard to taste and smell and can lead to nutritional problems in the elderly. Some research has found that more than 4 out of 5 people over the age of 80 have major impairments in smell, and more than half of them have almost no sense of smell at all. There is also decline in coordination and in reaction time. In essence, information processing begins to slow down and the motor coordination begins to decline, resulting in increase in work and home accidents. And so there's a decline in physical activities in general, just because of that concern. So there's an overall general decline in physiological functioning in late adulthood. Other things to be mindful of, there's a chemical composition of the bones begins to change. There's a greater likelihood of fractures. People will, in essence, begin to shrink as the discs between their spinal vertebrae begin to atrophy. And they even begin to look shorter because they have a stooped posture. And all of these systems begin and have a kind of a regular, steady decline, particularly after the age of 55. But for the case of this week, we're kind of going to be focusing on 65. But at 55 onward, there's a rhythm of accumulation of fatty deposits, within the body that causes decreased blood flow, and overall there are just a lot of health concerns that begin to take place. Hypertension, arthritis, heart disease, all of these will afflict at least 1/3 of people in late adulthood. Cataracts, between 16 and 17%. Hearing impairments, again, around 30%. Impairments to legs, hips, back, or spine, about 17%. But here's some interesting things. People over the age of 65 seem to have fewer colds and acute digestive problems. But they that may be because they've built up a reserve of capacity for fighting off these from their previous history of illnesses. So that might be part of it. As far as other areas that are of concern, learning begins to slow down in late adulthood. So inductive and deductive reasoning begins to slow down. So the cognitive functioning of an individual becomes slower. Not necessarily diminished in capacity, but in processing speed for sure. Older people tend to lack the capacity, though, for or interest in creative thinking. Now, that's of course not all creatives, because for some creatives, it's found that this can be a very productive age, particularly for people like musicians and novelists. But for others, they begin to tend towards convergent thinking rather than divergent thinking. And so can be a significant impact on some creative pursuits. And so for some people, they tend to move into a kind of mental rigidity. There's also a decline in strength of the flexor muscles of the forearms and the muscles that help to raise the body. There's a decrease in speed and reaction time and skilled movement, such as handwriting, over the age of 60. And in late adulthood, people just simply tend to become a little more awkward and clumsy, which causes them to spill and drop things, to trip and fall, and to do things in a careless, untidy manner. And so the breakdown of motor skills proceeds in adverse order to that which the skills were learned, with the earlier learned skills being the last to go. Now, as far as personality development in late adulthood, there is, of course, still development that's happening. Late adulthood is the development stage during which people clarify and find use for what they have used over the years and what they've learned over the years. People can continue to grow and adapt if they are willing to be flexible and realistic, if they learn how to conserve their strength, adjust to change and to, of course, loss, because this is a time of loss. So these years can be very productive for people. People are now aware of time and the importance of time, and they're also wanting to develop and leave a legacy, the fruits of their experiences, and to kind of confirm that they are and have lived a meaningful life. And so that brings us, of course, to Erik Erikson. So according to Erikson, the state of integrity versus despair emerges during this late adulthood. Now, Erikson sees older people as confronting a need to accept their lives how they have lived it, in order to accept their approaching death. And so they struggle to achieve a sense of integrity and of the coherence of the wholeness of life, rather than give way to a breaking apart of or recognizing that they had an inability to change the mistakes of their past. They can't go back and relive their life differently. And so they need to kind of reconcile what they've done with their lasting legacy within history. And so people who succeed in this final integrative task building, where they focus on the outcomes of the previous crises, can find a place of integrity rather than despairing. So there's a virtue that develops during this stage, and that virtue is often thought of as wisdom, as informed and detached concern for life itself, in the face of death itself. Recognizing that you only have a little bit of time left. There's no more concern about getting things necessarily or accumulating more, because death is very close at hand. And so wisdom, Erickson says, includes accepting the life one has lived without major regrets over what could have been or what should have been done differently. It involves accepting one's parents as people who did the best they could and thus deserve love, even though they were not perfect. It implies accepting one's own death as the inevitable end of a life lived, as well as one who knew how to live it. In essence, then, it means accepting the imperfections of the self, not only of the self, but of those who impacted your life. People who do not achieve acceptance are overwhelmed then by despair, realizing that time is too short to seek other roads to integrity. While integrity must outweigh despair if this crisis is to be resolved successfully, Erickson believes that some despair is going to be inevitable. There's going to be some things that people will mourn. People need to mourn not only their own misfortune and lost chance, but also for the vulnerability and transience of the human condition in general. And yet, Erickson also believes that late life is a time of play. A time in this wisdom to go back and revisit all of the other stages of things like generativity versus stagnation, of identity versus role confusion, and so on, to revisit and strengthen those in a way that is very childlike and open to reinventing oneself. So in this late adulthood, there's a time of play to recapture a childlike quality essential for creativity. And so I think that is a very valuable thing to be mindful of within life. I hope you enjoyed this week. You take care. Bye-bye.